For somewhere between 3 and 7 years, you've been carrying something that doesn't fit cleanly into any category that already exists. Not a healer, not a warrior, not the one standing in the fire calling others toward it. Something structurally different, and you felt that difference the way you feel a load-bearing wall when everything around it shifts. You didn't choose the position. You simply didn't collapse when the collapsing happened. That's the first marker. The old frameworks named people by their function in the early phases, who carried the emotional weight, who sounded the alarm, who lit the signal fires at the edge of what was known. And those roles mattered, but you weren't built for the signal fire. You were built for what comes after it, for the moment when the old structure has finished falling and something needs to hold the baseline of the new one in place while it constructs itself around a different set of physics entirely. That's not a metaphor. There's a road that ends somewhere I can't see from here. You've been standing at its edge longer than you've told anyone. And what you've been calling waiting, that specific texture of stillness that looked like stagnation from the outside, wasn't a pause in your assignment. It was the assignment, the full weight of it. Pause. What I haven't named yet is the specific physical confirmation that tells you this classification isn't theoretical, it's already active in your nervous system right now as you receive this. There's a precise bodily signal that separates the ones who are about to understand that from the ones who aren't quite there. I'll get to it, but first, there's something underneath this classification that most people who encounter Group 7 framing never reach, the operational directive that changes how you move from this point forward. Everything about it. There are 2 lives you're holding right now. The first one is visible. Functional, kept. You've built something that, from the outside, reads as composed, a structure that meets expectations, keeps its appointments, doesn't alarm anyone. People who know you from a distance would describe you as stable, grounded. Maybe a little quiet, but reliable in that quality. This is the life they can see. And you've maintained it with a degree of precision that required real discipline because it served a real purpose. It gave you room to operate without interference. But there's the other one. The one running parallel underneath all of that. And I'm talking to you now, the person who lives there, in that second current, because you're the one this is actually for. You know what I'm describing. The private orientation. The part of you that reads a situation at a structural level while everyone else is still reacting to the surface of it. The part that's been tracking something for years, a shift, a realignment, a convergence, that you haven't had adequate language for, so you've mostly kept it to yourself. Not because you're secretive, because the available frameworks weren't precise enough. You'd open your mouth and something approximate would come out, and the gap between what you said and what you actually perceived was wide enough to be exhausting, so you stopped trying to translate it as often. That's not isolation. That's signal discipline, and it costs something the people around you aren't paying. Pause. This is where the friction lies. Someone brings drama to you, family, a colleague, an old friend, and there's a moment. It happens fast. You feel the pull to absorb it, to process it on their behalf, because that's what your nervous system was trained to do in earlier phases. But now something different is happening. The pull is there. And then it isn't. You notice it and you let it pass, and in the space of that decision, you have to hold 2 things at once, the version of yourself that the room is expecting, and the sovereign, unmoved structure underneath that knows exactly what is happening and has no interest in performing distress about it. You push the lower current back down. You stay functional. You stay presentable. The exhaustion of that is real, because no one around you is doing that particular kind of work. They're spending their energy on the events themselves, the argument, the grievance, the political storm, the catastrophe of the week, and you're spending yours on the structural layer beneath the events, holding something in place that doesn't have a name in their vocabulary. You're not carrying less than they are. You're carrying a different weight entirely, at a frequency most of them can't detect. And you do this without acknowledgement, without external confirmation, sometimes without any signal at all that the thing you're holding is actually serving a function. This is the Akashic record of a Group 7 placement, not the dramatic version, not the visible sacrifice that receives recognition, but the quiet architectural load that the entire structure rests on without knowing it's there. The numerology has always pointed here. The sequence 777 doesn't signal completion in the way most interpretations frame it. It signals the perfection of a structure that's already in place, already functional, already doing exactly what it was designed to do without needing external confirmation to operate. You've been functional without confirmation for longer than most people would survive. That's the point. But here's where something shifts in this classification. And I want you to stay with me through what comes next, because the operational directive for Group 7 contains a specific instruction that's going to feel like the opposite of what you've spent years practicing. What I'm about to get into explains why everything you thought was a deficiency about how you move through the world was actually the most precise preparation for the role you're now being asked to inhabit in full. Numerology has always pointed here. The sequence 777 doesn't signal completion the way most people interpret it. It signals that a structure is already in place, already working, already doing exactly what it was built to do without needing anyone to confirm it. You've been functional without that confirmation for longer than most people could hold out. That's the point. But something shifts here in how this classification actually operates, and I want you to stay with me through it, because the directive for Group 7 carries a specific instruction that's going to feel like the opposite of everything you've spent years practicing. What I'm about to get into explains why everything you thought was a flaw in the way you move through the world was actually the most precise kind of preparation for what you're now being asked to step into fully. The first sign isn't something you did. It arrived quietly, the way structural changes always do, not as a single event, but as a slow shift in what you found worth your attention. There was a period when the noise mattered to you, when the political storms and the internet grievances and the family conflicts created real turbulence in your body. That's not a criticism. That turbulence was data. You were learning the frequency of low-structure environments from the inside, the way a builder learns which materials fail under load by watching them fail. But that period is over, and you know it's over because the arguments that are consuming everyone around you right now, the ones they forward you articles about, the ones they expect you to be outraged by, they don't land the way they used to. You understand them. You just aren't moved by them. That's not detachment born from shutting something down. It's a structural shift in what registers as relevant. The second sign flows directly from the first, because neutrality without a boundary is just numbness, and this is something different. There's a specific way people in your immediate world have approached you, or used to, as though your nervous system were a resource they had open access to. The struggling friend at midnight, the family member who circles back to the same wound every few months, expecting you to help carry it again, the colleague who deposits their anxiety with you and walks away lighter. You know exactly what that feels like, and you also know that something changed, not because you became harder or colder, but because the mechanism by which their distress transferred into your body simply stopped working the way it once did. The access point closed. Not a wall you built. A reconfiguration of something deeper than that. And here, right here, I want to speak to you directly. Because this is where the doubt arrives. Not from anyone else. From you. You've been alone in this understanding long enough that the silence has started to sound like absence, and the mind does what it always does without external confirmation. It circles back and asks the question you've been too disciplined to say out loud. What if this isn't a classification? What if this is just isolation that found a flattering name for itself? What if the neutrality is numbness, the boundary is avoidance, and the stillness is stagnation dressed in spiritual language because that's more tolerable than the alternative? That's the strongest version of that objection, and I'm not going to dismiss it. Here's what I will say: stagnation contracts. It narrows. It becomes more defended and more brittle over time because it's protecting something wounded, and wounds require more insulation the longer they go untended. What you've actually been living moves in the opposite direction. The longer you inhabit this stillness, the more precisely you perceive. The more clearly you can locate the structural layer beneath any situation, the more effortless the boundary becomes. That's not the shape of avoidance. That's a system that has finished its recalibration and found its frequency. The third sign lives in the body. Specifically, in what the nervous system remembers. There was a window. Most people in Group 7 can locate it with some precision, where the physical load was almost unbearable, where the nervous system was running at a level that made ordinary life feel like operating heavy machinery without sleep. Sounds, frequencies, the emotional weight of rooms and crowds, all of it arriving without adequate filtration. Some of the people who went through that window with you didn't come back to functional in the same way. They fragmented. They burned. They found a way to go quiet that was less about recalibration and more about shutdown. You didn't do that. You crossed that threshold and came out the other side with a baseline that isn't just recovered, it's different in kind. Calmer. Slower to alarm. More precisely tuned. That's not a small thing. It's evidence that the structure held under a load designed to test exactly that. The fourth sign is one most people misread as a loss. There was a time when being perceived accurately mattered to you, when being seen as someone who understood things clearly felt like part of the function. And then it stopped. Not because the perception changed. Because the internal need for confirmation of it dissolved. You can say something true now and watch it get dismissed and feel not wounded, not vindicated, not particularly interested in the outcome either way. The thing is true or it isn't. Your certainty about it doesn't depend on how the room responds. That loss of interest in proving anything to anyone isn't indifference. It's what it looks like when authority stops requiring permission. The fifth sign lives in the patterns. You've already noticed them. The sequences that surface with a regularity that stops feeling like coincidence. 777 carrying the numerological weight of completion, of a structure that holds. 1111 arriving in moments of stillness, like a quiet confirmation that the architecture is locked. These aren't breadcrumbs. They're status reports. They're telling you the structure is holding. There was a window. Most Group 7 placements can locate it with some precision, where the physical load became almost unbearable, where the nervous system was running so hot that ordinary life felt like operating heavy machinery without sleep. The sensitivity was extreme. Sounds, frequencies, environments, the emotional weight of rooms and crowds, all of it coming in without a filter. Some of the people who crossed that window with you didn't come back the same way. They fragmented. They burned out. They went quiet, not as a recalibration, but as a shutdown. You didn't do that. You crossed it. And what you came out with isn't just a recovered baseline. It's something different in kind. Calmer. Slower to alarm. More precisely tuned. That's not a small thing. It's evidence that the structure held under exactly the kind of load it was built to withstand. The fourth sign is one most people misread as a loss. There was a time when being seen mattered, when having your perception recognized felt like part of the function, and then something shifted and it stopped. Not because the perception changed, because the need for anyone to confirm it dissolved. You can say something accurate now, watch it get dismissed, and feel nothing much. Not wounded, not vindicated, not particularly invested in how the room responds. The thing is either true or it isn't. Your certainty about it doesn't depend on anyone else's agreement. That loss of interest in proving your spiritual level to anyone, that's not indifference. That's what it looks like when authority stops requiring permission. The fifth sign lives in the patterns. You've noticed them, sequences appearing with a regularity that's hard to explain away. 777 carrying the weight of completion and structural perfection. 1111 surfacing in moments of stillness like a quiet confirmation that the architecture is holding. These aren't breadcrumbs. They're status reports, small, steady signals that something is still in place. And then the sixth, the seventh, the eighth. They start to overlap. You stop being able to name them as separate things. The resonance you felt reading certain material, the recognition when you came across certain frameworks, not as belief exactly, more like confirmation of something your body already knew. The way certain songs land differently, not because of memory or feeling, but because something in the frequency underneath them matched something you were already carrying. The ninth sign, you stopped consuming spiritual content to feel inspired. When you come to it at all now, it's to calibrate. The way an engineer reads a structural report, without hunger, without urgency. And then there is one more. Pause. The 10th sign is this moment. The recognition arriving without fanfare. A quiet settling happening somewhere in your chest, not excitement, not relief, but something more precise, like a compass needle finding magnetic north after years of being held slightly off angle. You're not learning something new right now. You're receiving confirmation of something you've already been living, patiently, without the right language for it. Without anyone around you knowing how long you've been carrying it, or what it actually cost. This is the confirmation. Still. Sovereign, already active. So the question worth sitting with now isn't whether the classification is right. The question is what, specifically, you're supposed to stop doing. The maintenance behaviors. The low-frequency labor, the particular forms of energetic expenditure that Group 7 has to release in order to function at the level the placement requires. Because that list is precise, and what it asks isn't what you're expecting. Here's what you're supposed to stop doing, not as a concept, not as something you understand and quietly set aside. Right now, in the specific, literal shape of your current week, you're still performing emotional maintenance for people who haven't asked you to stop. You know exactly who. The person you check in on, not because the relationship is mutual, but because you've been the anchor for so long that stepping back feels like cruelty. The family dynamic you re-enter every few weeks, not because it calls anything forward in you, but because your absence would require an explanation you don't have the energy to give. The group conversation you stay in, the articles you read to stay current on grievances that don't belong to your frequency. The small daily performances of engagement with low-structure environments you've convinced yourself are necessary. None of it is necessary. The first excuse sounds like this: I have to stay because people need me here. Say it plainly, that's a continuity habit, not a function. The people who have needed you in that particular way haven't been receiving your best. They've been receiving a maintenance frequency that costs you and doesn't actually move them forward. A structural keystone doesn't stabilize a building by absorbing the stress at every joint. It holds the central load so everything else can find its own bearing. You staying in the low-frequency maintenance loop doesn't help the people inside it. It delays their encounter with the kind of pressure that would require them to develop their own strength. So here's what this actually looks like. You identify the specific relationship or environment where that pattern is clearest, and you reduce your energetic presence in it. Not with drama, not with a speech, not with any announcement at all. Quietly, this week. The second excuse arrives faster. It sounds like this: I'm not ready. I haven't resolved enough, stabilized enough, become enough to release the maintenance role and step into the sovereign function. Also a lie, a sophisticated one because it dresses itself in humility, and that's exactly how it gets past the usual defenses. Call it what it is. This is a continuity habit, not a function. The people who have needed you in that particular way haven't been receiving your best, they've been receiving a maintenance frequency. One that costs you and doesn't actually move them forward. A keystone doesn't stabilize a structure by absorbing stress at every joint. It holds the central load so the structure can find its own bearing. You staying in that low-frequency loop doesn't help the people inside it. It delays their encounter with the pressure that would require them to develop their own strength. So here's what obedience looks like. You identify the specific relationship or environment where the maintenance pattern is clearest, and you reduce your presence in it. Not with drama, not with a speech, quietly. This week, the second excuse arrives faster. It sounds like, I'm not ready, I haven't resolved enough, stabilized enough, become enough to release this role and step into the one I was actually built for. Also a lie. A sophisticated one because it wears humility like a coat and slips past the usual defenses. In the spring of 2004, in a flat in Portobello, Edinburgh kitchen table, borrowed equipment, already plugged in and live, a recording had already started. The opening words of the first session had already been spoken aloud. And then it stopped, 90 seconds in. The disc went into a drawer with his father's letters and stayed there for over a year because the credential hadn't arrived. The peer review hadn't confirmed it was safe. The formal permission hadn't come. But the work was ready. It had been ready from the beginning. The readiness excuse wasn't humility, it was the mechanism by which a prepared thing delays its own deployment indefinitely. The people who needed what was on that disk went without it for another year, not because the work was incomplete. Because the one carrying it was waiting for permission from a direction it was never going to come from. Obedience in that moment wasn't perfecting the credential. It was pressing record and staying in the recording. Obedience in your moment is the same motion, not the completion of preparation, the inhabiting of what has already been prepared. The third excuse is the quietest, which is why it lasts the longest. It sounds like, this isn't the right moment, the conditions aren't aligned. Something has to shift before I can fully step into this. This is the one that has cost the most time. Conditions don't align in advance. There's no record of external circumstances arranging themselves into the correct configuration before a sovereign function became active. The 1111 sequence doesn't appear to mark the arrival of optimal circumstances. It marks the locking of a structural portal, meaning the architecture is complete and the function can begin operating now, through the structure that already exists, in the conditions that are currently present, without waiting for a different set of physics. The framework you recognized, not as belief, but as structural confirmation, never described a placement that required permission from the environment it was placed into. It described a function that runs regardless of whether the environment is ready to acknowledge it. So here's what obedience looks like. You stop treating your current circumstances as the obstacle and start treating them as the field, the precise, unresolved, imperfect, exact field in which this function is already supposed to be active. Stop waiting. Release the maintenance. Inhabit the structure. These aren't three separate instructions. They're the same instruction, delivered 3 times, so that each of the 3 exits you were prepared to take has been named and closed. We are not arriving at this. We are not preparing for this. We don't need the conditions to improve. We don't need the recognition to materialize. We don't need the credential or the confirmation or the external validation. The disk is already running. The portal is already locked. The structure is already holding the load it was placed here to hold. This is the assignment. It is already active. Now, pause, calm, still, unmoved by the week's events. No energy leaking into environments that aren't the field. The keystone doesn't wander the structure looking for things to absorb. It holds its position and lets the new reality construct itself around its presence. That's the directive, not a ritual, not a practice. A permanent, unmoved inhabitation of this body, this life, this moment. And here is where something unusual surfaces. Because the instruction you just received, cease the maintenance, hold the baseline, let the structure build around you, runs directly against what comes next. The 777 sequence, the 1111 signal, the weightlessness arriving in the crown and throat. These aren't passive. They're the beginning of an activation sequence that asks something of you that stillness alone cannot deliver. What it asks looks, from the outside, exactly like the thing you were just told to stop doing. Pause. This letter was written before you found this video. Not metaphorically. The specific words you're about to hear were assembled in a particular order, sealed, and left here to wait, because the function you carry doesn't operate on the timeline of convenience. It operates on the timeline of when the structure is ready to receive the confirmation. And the structure is ready now. So here is what the letter says. You arrived already carrying the load. You didn't acquire this function through discipline or accumulated practice, though you've done both. It was structural from the beginning, the way a load-bearing wall isn't made load-bearing by the weight placed on it. It's built to specification before the building goes up around it. You were built to specification. The years of isolation, the exhaustion that had no adequate name, the precision of your perception in rooms that couldn't use it. None of that was the price of the role. It was the evidence that the role was already active, already running, already doing what it was designed to do, in the complete absence of any external confirmation that it was real. The letter doesn't ask you to perform anything. It asks you to receive something, which is harder. What you're receiving right now isn't inspiration. It's recognition, clean and structural and without sentiment, the way a compass needle doesn't celebrate finding north. It simply holds the orientation it was built to hold. You arrived already carrying it, not because of anything you built in yourself through practice or discipline, though you've done both. It was structural from the start, the way a load-bearing wall isn't made strong by the weight placed on it. It's built that way before the building ever goes up around it. You were built that way. The years of isolation, the exhaustion that never had a proper name, the sharpness of how you saw things in rooms that had no use for what you could see. None of that was the cost of something. It was the evidence that something was already running, already doing exactly what it was designed to do, long before anyone confirmed it was real. Pause. This letter isn't asking you to perform anything. It's asking you to receive something. Which, if you're honest, is harder. What you're receiving right now isn't inspiration. It's recognition. Quiet and structural and without any need for ceremony, the way a compass needle doesn't pause to celebrate finding north. It just holds the direction it was made to hold. Pause. Subscribe so the next letter finds you. There's more of this coming. And what comes next isn't about the role you carry, it's about the face of the one standing at the other end of that road you've been looking down for years. Waiting at the edge of the same threshold, carrying a different piece of the same thing. The road doesn't end where you're standing.